Hello everyone, welcome to Cloud War. My name is Santiago. In today's video, we will continue with the Azure series working with the Kubernetes cluster. In this video, we will be working on the workload identity. We are going to explain what is that piece of the Kubernetes cluster, and also we are going to be working throughout the CLI in order to update the existing cluster that we already created in previous session with this new implementation. In case you haven't created a new Kubernetes cluster already, I will be also giving the proper commands to apply exactly the same changes when you are creating a cluster from scratch. So in order to comply with these requirements, we updating the existing AKS cluster or creating a new one with a couple of changes. We will be enabling something that is the OIDC issuer, and also the workload identity will be enabled in the Azure cluster. After that, we will learn how to retrieve this OIDC issuer URL in order to make the authentication happen. I will explain in a moment what is that bit and how actually work. And after that, we'll be setting up the federated credential that is going to work together with the managed identity in order to access Azure resources. So in order to be able to do that piece, let's try to understand first why we are doing this and what is the main objective of using workload identity. So as we saw on previous video, when we interact with everything that is related to the Kubernetes cluster, we use locally a tool known as kubectl. Well, the kubectl, what actually does is to reach out through an internal API to something that is named the kubelet. The kubelet is that main part of the Kubernetes cluster that allows us to manage and administer any resources from the pipeline or throughout the CLI using basic commands. So when the kubelet is going to interact with the AKS cluster workload directly, that means with a deployment in this case, he is going to be requesting an access token throughout a configuration file. So when the AKS workload requires an authentication to access an Azure resource, he is going to make a request to the Azure Active Directory, and the Azure Active Directory is going to use the OpenID discovery document that we will set up throughout the OIDC command. When this part of the project has been completed, the Azure Active Directory will return to the AKS cluster, specifically to the deployment we are trying to work on, the permission he has access to. And after that, the token will be checked against the resources that we have set up in order to see we actually have the proper permissions. Everything that I just explained goes through the managed identity that we set up in previous videos as well. And as you know, the managed identities can have permission to one or multiple Azure services and is going to give you that granular segregation of different permissions. So as a reminder, for example, we can set up the managed identity to have access to an Azure Key Vault or have access maybe to a storage account, maybe to Cosmos DB, SQL Server, and any resources that we need to. So if a deployment in this case try to create an access request to, for example, to the SQL database, as long as the OIDC issuer that is going to be set up throughout the managed identity has the proper permission, it will be able to access to. Quite the contrary, we try to access a resource that is not part of the managed identity RBAC configuration, of course it's going to reject that request. So in more other short terms, so we make this request to the Kubernetes workload, to the Azure Active Directory. We request the token using the issuer. The issuer is also known as the OIDC issuer URL. This is something that we are going to enable in the Kubernetes cluster to make exchange of credential. And with this, we use the OpenID connector issuer in order to exchange that. With this token, we check the permissions and everything that is required, and that is going to be the main entry to access the Azure resources. Here it comes the important part. Everything that we speak about so far sounds pretty fancy and maybe could be a little bit overcomplicated. In short terms, we actually have to implement everything from scratch. The good news is that we only need to enable the OIDC issuer in the AKS cluster. We only need to enable the workload identity as well. And we need to have a managed identity that our pods or deployment can consume in order to access those resources. The other parts that we see with the creation of the token and the request throughout the Azure services and everything happens automatically on the Kubernetes cluster and the Active Directory, and we don't have to do anything. The good thing is that the Kubernetes cluster also deploy a couple of resources that we will explore after we enable the workload identity. And those resources actually are the ones that makes the token exchange and send those tokens throughout the Active Directory back to our deployments. So with that in hand, let's start with the first page where we are going to be enabling the OIDC issuer and also the workload identity. So let's get started. Okay, now that we are in the CLI, the first thing that we need to do is to update the existing Kubernetes cluster that we already created to enable the OIDC issuer, and also we are going to be updating the cluster to enable the workload identity. So as previous session, we already saw that we can use the AC, AKS, and the operation that we would like to do, in this case will be the update one. So we need to provide as always the resource group, which is stored in my case in this RG variable. In case you don't have that variable defined, just set it up using the name of your resource group, or type manually the name of your resource group. That's okay as well. So we need to provide the name of the cluster too, which is also stored in this AKS variable. And from here we need to use the enable OIDC issuer, and also we need to enable the workload identity. With these commands, we are going to be doing both things at the same time, enabling in the AKS cluster the OIDC issuer and the workload identity. In case you want to create your cluster from scratch, you can use exactly the same sentence that you are seeing on the screen right now. Just make sure to replace the update operation with a create operation. That will create the Kubernetes cluster since the beginning with the OIDC issuer and also with the workload identity. So let's execute this command. This might take a couple of minutes and we will be back to see the response. Okay, now that our Kubernetes cluster have the OIDC issuer and also the workload identity enabled, the next thing that we would like to do is to retrieve the OIDC issuer. For that, we will be using the operation to show the Kubernetes cluster configuration. In this case, it's going to be the AC AKS show. As always, we provide the resource group, the name of the AKS cluster, and in this case, we'll be using a query just to select the OIDC issuer profile.issuer URL. We are going to be requesting this to be in output TSB. For this part, I'm going to store this part of the variable in OIDC. An OIDC variable in order just to keep the URL in here. This is going to simplify things after in the next part of the process. So let's give it a second to display the information. So this is going to store the variable. I am not going to be displaying the real URL because it contains some sensitive data, but if everything goes correctly and you print the OIDC variable in your console, or you just execute manually the query without storing into a variable, the response will be something similar to this part. It will be the region where your Kubernetes cluster is located, OIC prod AKS Azure.com, and it's going to provide a couple of widgets that represent your subscription ID and the ID of the issuer. This URL is going to be very helpful in a few minutes when we make a couple of updates to the managed identity. So let's now retrieve the managed identity just to remember a couple of things throughout the CLI. Now let's take a look into the managed identities that we have created in the Azure portal, just as a quick reminder. So let's use the AC identity list, and in this case I will be selecting the name of all the managed identities that I have available in the Azure portal. So if you remember correctly, we have two managed identities set up in my case, and one of them is going to be one that is created automatically with the Azure Kubernetes cluster, and in this case is the agent pool. This is something to set up permission between the VMs that handle the AKS cluster compute power and the Azure resources. We don't have to manage anything manually in this case. So let's move into the second one. The Azure Labs MA is the one that we created in previous videos. In case you haven't created a managed identity, you can create one and use whatever name you like. Just remember to set it up for the next variable. So I'm going to store this configuration in my ID, Azure Labs ID. And we are going to require this in order to extract the client ID for the managed identity. So the client ID is just a widget that represents your managed identity in the Azure portal as a unique resource and a unique global identifier. So let's store into the client ID variable, and let's use the AC identity show command. We are going to, as always, provide the resource group, also the name of the managed identity that we like to query. And for the result, we are going to be selecting the client ID, and we are going to be setting the output to TCP to simplify things. Okay, in this case, you can print the client ID in your PowerShell console. You will be able to see that you have a GUID stored in that variable, and this is going to be very helpful in a moment when we set up the OIDC issuer and the federated credential based on that. The next step, we will be doing a setup of the federated credential. The federated credential is going to be that part of the URL that is going to set up together with the managed identity, which is going to take care of the token exchange. So that configuration between the managed identity having the proper RBAC and also the OIDC issuer that the cluster has enabled, the federated credential will be the intermediary that represents the interest of the AKS cluster against the Azure Resources in order to exchange those permissions. So it's going to be the middle point between the managed identity and the AKS cluster using the OIDC issuer and the RBAC configuration from the Azure Active Directory. So in order to achieve that part, we will once more use the AC identity command, and in this case we'll be using the federated credential operation and the create operation too. So we need to provide a name. In this case we are going to be using the Azure Labs Fed. For the identity name, we will be setting up the managed identity we already stored, the resource group as always too. We are going to be using the OIDC URL that we already also stored in the variable. This is the URL all the OIDC user set up in your AKS cluster. And this particular piece is going to make sense more closely on the next video when we do a couple of extra setup in the AKS cluster. But in order to be able to exchange tokens between a managed identity and the AKS cluster using the OIDC user and the federated credential, you need to say who is the subject of that authentication and token exchange. In this case, since we are working with a Kubernetes cluster, the object that is going to represent that authentication is something that is known as a service account, which is a concept in the AKS cluster for security and authentication and role permissions delegation. So in order to locate the service account that is going to have the permission, we have to provide the namespace that is going to be represented in the AKS cluster and also the name of the service account we would like to use to tie together everything. So let's take a look what we have in the NS variable. So in the NS variable we have Azure Labs, and in the service account we set up the name as Azure Labs AC. None of the resources still exist on the AKS cluster. We will be creating those, both the namespace and the service account, so it makes more sense for you. So let's execute this. And once we got the response, we can see the federated credential has been created. Let's take a look very quickly how it looks like on the Azure portal, so you can get very familiar with the OIDC issuer as well in the AKS cluster and the whole federated credential as part of the managed identity. So now that we are in the Azure portal, we will be able to go to our managed identity and we will be able to see the next thing. Just make sure that you go to the managed identity you specified throughout the CLI and go into the settings tab and go to the federated credentials option. As you can see, we have the federated credential we just created. You will see the issuer URL in here according to the values that you have. This is going to be of course very different. This is just a dummy template to show you here. And the subject identifier, as you can see, is the system, the service account type, and the service account namespace and the service account name that we set up. If you click on the Azure Labs Fed, you will be able to see the next information, which is going to expand even more what we just did in a more visual manner. So the first thing that you will see is that the federated credential scenario is going to be configure a Kubernetes service account to get Docker application access. You will see on the cluster issuer URL, we have the issuer OIDC URL that we got from the Kubernetes cluster setup in here. And the namespace is going to be the one that we specify as well for the Kubernetes cluster and also the service account. So as you can see, this federated credential is going to be that middle point that is going to be used throughout the service account in order to exchange token with the Azure portal. So this is for this part of the video. In the next session, we will be creating in the Kubernetes cluster the service account. We are also be creating the namespace as well. And we are going to be some of the most important things that we need to set up in the service account in order to make the final setup. After that, we will be deploying a very basic application just to display that we have access to the proper resources. And the managed identity, the federated credential, and the OIDC issue are actually working as expected. So we can go back to the next videos when we are going to be working once more with the Kubernetes cluster and the Azure Service Bus to send messages and consume those messages as well. So thank you for joining me today and see you in the next adventure.